Thank you, David, very much for inviting me and making this such an enjoyable visit. Dinner last night at Asiatique, staying in the Brown Hotel, very pleasant. Actually, a couple of disclaimers. This talk really isn't squarely on synthetic biology. It's on genetic modification of humans, but I think a lot of what's said would apply to the idea of using synthetic biology techniques with humans. This presentation is based on this paper, which I'm the second author with Russell Powell. Russell Powell's a philosopher of biology, bioethicist person who's now on a postdoc at Oxford at the Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics. One other disclosure, sometime during the talk you may see me wince. And it's not that you've said something during the discussion that I find painful. It's that I've managed to tear some soft tissue in my hip. And every now and then, completely unpredictably, if I turn, it feels like somebody's sticking a hot poker into my hip. And so if you see me grimace and maybe stagger a little bit, don't take it personally. Now, a little background on this paper. I've been working for some time on the ethics of using biotechnologies to enhance normal human capacities, biomedical enhancements. And in the process of doing that work, it became clearer and clearer to me that a good deal of the literature on the ethics of biomedical enhancement was really written from a perspective that was pre-Darwinian. That is, people didn't seem to have gotten the Darwinian revolution in biology. And that's going to be a good deal of the theme of my talk today. I think it makes a huge difference as to how you look at nature and human nature. If you look at it in a Darwinian way, you'll, just to put it most crudely, you'll be at least more receptive in principle to biomedical interventions designed to improve human beings. On the other hand, if you have a kind of pre-Darwinian view of nature, very rosy, very benign, very harmonious, then you'll be extremely worried about the idea of intervening and changing our biology in some way. So here is the talk in a preview in quotations. These are three mottos for the talk. One is a famous fragment from a Tennyson poem where he refers to nature as red in tooth and claw. The second is a quote from Darwin in a letter to his friend Joseph Hooker. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering low, and horridly cruel works of nature. And then finally, a quote from one of my favorite novels, a novel called The Leopard that was written in 1950 by a Sicilian. And one of the characters in it says, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. It's paradoxical, but I think you'll see it has some relevance to our topic. So Tennyson says nature is bloody. Darwin says nature is bloody and inept. Remember, he said it's clumsy, blundering low. And Tancredi says we sometimes have to change to preserve what we have. Now I'm going to just list some concerns about biomedical enhancement, and then I'm going to home in on the use of germline modifications in humans as a mode of enhancement. But actually what I will have to say will apply to germline modification whether the aim of it is enhancing human capacities or not. There are worries about damaging or destroying human nature, undermining natural human relationships. There are worries about unintended bad consequences, whether biological or social. There are worries about what you might call character. There are character concerns. Some people, like Michael Sandel, think that the very pursuit of enhancement, quite apart from any bad effects that might occur, shows that there's something wrong with our values, something wrong with our character. Then there are worries about distributive justice, worries that if biomedical enhancements become available, they'll be likely to be expensive, and so people who are already well off will get them, and the gap between the better off and the worse off will simply increase. Then there are so-called dual-use concerns, worries about whether technologies, including germline modification, but other kinds of biomedical enhancement technologies, might be used deliberately for wrongful purposes. And I say deliberately here to contrast this with the second item, the unintended bad consequences. Worry is that these technologies would be put to use for repressive social control, weaponry, creating remorseless soldiers through chemical management of memory. The last item is not as speculative as you might think. It turns out the Pentagon is investing quite substantial amount of money in a program to try to modify memory processes in soldiers. The explicit justification for the program is that this will help reduce post-traumatic stress syndrome, but some more skeptical types, and I wouldn't say that I'm one of them, think that another goal of this might be to produce soldiers who can just keep killing efficiently and seeing all sorts of horrible things go on around them without breaking down psychologically and becoming combat ineffective, which tends to happen on average after about 9 months of combat. People become really impaired in their effectiveness. And then there are worries about not just our government using these technologies, but, rogue states or non-state terrorists. Now I'm going to focus on only one of these, bad unintended consequences, and I'm going to focus on biological versus social consequences. And more specifically, I'm going to focus on the risks of intentional germline genetic modifications aimed at enhancement. Though again, it'll apply to those kinds of techniques whether the aim is enhancement or something else. And we'll just call that IGM, intentional germline modification. Now, it's very common for people to say, well, perhaps some biomedical enhancements might be permissible, might even be a good thing, but any that involve germline modifications of humans should just be taken off the table. We should draw a bright line and not go in that direction. And they often say this because they think that such techniques would produce irreversible changes, and if there are mistakes, if there are unintended bad consequences, then they'll be irrevocable, and even worse, they'll be self-perpetuating as these things are passed down. Other people say that IGM interferes with the wisdom of nature, that is, that it tampers irresponsibly with the work of the master engineer of evolution. And if some of you are familiar with the former President Bush's Council on Bioethics report, Beyond Therapy, which is on ethical issues in enhancement, there are passages in that volume in which we're told that human beings as they are now are the product of eons of exacting evolution, and that any attempt by us to improve them is almost certain to end badly. Well, let's look briefly at this idea, first of all, that IGM is especially risky because its consequences or effects are irreversible. In fact, they're not irreversible because genotype doesn't equal phenotype. We already have very sophisticated techniques for controlling the expression of genes in laboratory animals. For example, you can engineer mice so that you have to you can insert a gene in a mouse embryo, and you can arrange it so that you have to administer a drug for the gene to be expressed, or you can administer drugs to block the expression of the gene. So it's simply just not true, obviously, that if you make a mistake, the mistake is going to be irreversible. And it doesn't really matter if the genes are passed on. What matters is the expression of the genes. Also, it's worth pointing out that UGM, that is evolution as usual, unintentional genetic modification that goes on through the processes Darwin first began to characterize, there is a risk of irreversible bad consequences there. Why? Because valuable genes routinely become extinct. I want to look at this master engineer analogy, which you see fairly frequently in the bioethics literature on the ethics of enhancement. It's the idea that the evolved human organism is finely balanced, somehow complete, optimal, harmonious, like the product of a master engineer. And of course, if you buy into that analogy, then you'll think immediately that it's foolish and dangerous for us to try to tamper with this master work. And it's not just President Bush's counsel. There's a couple of very sophisticated bioethicists at Oxford, Anders Sandberg and Nick Bostrom, and they have a paper called Evolutionary Heuristics, some sort of cautionary principles for how to undertake germline modification in humans, and they actually explicitly buy into the master engineer analogy. But the question is UGM really like a master engineer? I'm going to argue that it's not. And let me add one more disclaimer. I already mentioned two earlier, and that is, it may sound like it, but in this talk I'm not arguing in favor of germline modification of human beings for purposes of enhancement or for any purpose. Instead, what I'm trying to do is to get a better framing of the issue of whether, under some circumstances in the future, it might be permissible or even advisable to use those kinds of techniques. So it's not that I'm arguing in favor of germline modification of humans. I'm arguing against certain ways of framing the issue which I think prejudice a reasonable consideration of the pros and cons. So I'm going to propose a counter-analogy to the master engineer analogy. And I'm going to try to convince you that every adjective in the counter-analogy is accurate from a Darwinian biological standpoint. But then in the end, I'm going to say, let's forget about these analogies. They're all misleading to some extent. And I'm going to try to focus on what we really should be thinking about. But bear with me first. What I want to do, this is my strategy, I want to compare IgM and UGM in a very special way with regard to their capacity for improving or even sustaining human life. And I'm just going to compare them as techniques, as it were, as mechanisms. Okay. I'm going to say, look, let's think about what IgM is like. Let's think about what UGM is like just as a kind of technique. What are the possibilities of these? Judged from the standpoint of the project of improving human life or even preserving what we have now. So to begin the comparison, I want to talk about what the limitations are on UGM, what makes it in some ways not such a good mechanism or toolkit for improving human life or preserving it. And I refer you again back to Darwin's quote. His big point is that evolution, as usual, without deliberate human efforts at germline modification, is not like a master engineer. Suboptimal design is pervasive, and it's a necessary feature of evolution as he understands it. It's not a sort of a perturbation or a sometime unfortunate side effect. It's integral to the process itself. And this is just a reminder. I think it's inaccurate to say that Darwin showed how intelligent design was possible without God. His point, as the quote reveals, is that we can explain how diversity and change occur in nature without intelligent design. That's why he calls nature clumsy and blundering low. Here's some examples of poor design, and I'll be looking at the faces of people in the audience to see which ones they resonate with the most. You can probably guess which ones I resonate with the most here. This will vary as to gender and other factors. This odd arrangement in male mammals that the urinary tract passes through, not around the prostate. Primate sinuses, they're actually upside down to some extent. You'd think that they were built for us walking around standing on our heads most of the time because they drain the wrong way. There's also a human inability and inability of all primates to biosynthesize vitamin C, apparently because of a process of pseudogenization of genes which used to enable our distant ancestors, pre-human ancestors, pre-primate mammal ancestors, to biosynthesize vitamin C. And apparently those critters lived in an environment for a long enough period where there was lots of citrus fruit available that the process of pseudogenization occurred with the genes for enabling them to biosynthesize vitamin C. They didn't need those genes. Like other genes, they accumulated mutations. The mutated versions didn't get weeded out by natural selection because they didn't need them. And the result is that critters like you and I can't biosynthesize vitamin C. This has caused huge problems for human beings for a very long time. Another example, the human pharynx. kind of an odd arrangement to have basically the same setup for air intake and food intake. And the result is that humans have a much higher incidence of death by choking than almost any other mammals we know of. Then there's the problem with the human birth canal passing through the female pelvis. At roughly around the time of the shift to bipedalism, you also get, somewhat later than that, an expansion of the cranium. This is a very bad combination, as any childbearing women in the audience can tell you. Then there's the lower back. Probably most of you don't need to be informed that the problems there are pretty significant costs from shifting to bipedalism. Now, there are lots of other problems that occur with humans and with every species. There's a famous paper by the philosopher Thomas Nagel called What It Is Like to Be a Bat. I see the philosophers in the audience resonating to this. And it was a paper in the philosophy of mind, sort of trying to figure out how the world would look to the consciousness of a bat. Well, I have a different answer to the question of what it's like to be a bat. It's very nasty. And if this weren't the lunch hour, I would do a demonstration, which I do for my students. It involves taking a tube of toothpaste and taking the cap off and holding it and squeezing it until all the stuff runs down like this. The point is that bats spend an inordinate amount of their time hanging upside down, packed very closely together. And they're engineered just like other mammals that don't hang upside down. And so when they defecate, it just runs down all over them. And this is not only presumably somewhat unpleasant for bats, but it contributes to infections that sweep through bat populations from time to time. If you were a student of biomedical engineering and you were assigned the task de novo to design a flying mammal, and you turned in the design for actual bats, you would flunk the course. It would not be. You would not be doing well. Now, I've just given a few examples, just the tip of the iceberg of suboptimal designs. But we have to ask why suboptimal design is ubiquitous. And it's because there are constraints on UGM as a process. And I'm going to regard it as a process for improving our lives, human lives, or even for sustaining human lives. And here are just some of those constraints that make it a less than optimal process for those purposes. First of all, and every day I get older, I've become more and more impressed with this one, the insensitivity of natural selection to post-reproductive quality of life. This leads to predictable cardiovascular degeneration, accumulation of mutations leading to cancer, degeneration of muscles and joints, neural degeneration. The fact that natural selection doesn't work very well, if at all, to select out those problems that occur post-reproductively is especially portentous given that human beings have gotten to be living much, much longer. So if you have people living much, much longer, but with a bigger accumulation of these problems that aren't getting winnowed out because, to put it in sort of an anthropomorphic way, the organism doesn't have sufficient incentive to invest in repair, then you have a really serious problem. And you might have people living to be 120 years old, but the accumulation of problems would be so great that we might judge that overall we're living better lives now than those people are living, even though they're living much, much longer. Now, in principle, IgM, and I say in principle, can avoid or ameliorate harms resulting from UGM's insensitivity to post-reproductive quality of life through modification of oncogenes and or ramping up of tumor-suppressing genes, through modifications of genetic networks regulating hormones to prevent muscle loss, etc. Here's another constraint of UGM. In UGM, selection does not imply optimality, even understood in the narrow way of reproductive fitness. And that's because to say that a trait has been selected for, that is an adaptation, indicates etiology. It indicates how the trait came to spread through a population and become fixed in it. It says nothing about the current relationship between the trait and reproductive fitness. Optimality regarding reproductive fitness depends on the fit between the organism and the environment. The environment is constantly changing. so optimality is only fleetingly approximated. And of course, human beings are niche builders par excellence. We're constantly changing our environment and wittingly and unwittingly changing the selective forces that are brought to bear on us. So, what was optimal may now be fatal. The current organism is not the apex of eons of exacting evolution. Extant organisms are not superior in design to extinct ones. To be able to say that in general, existing members of various species are the best designed, you'd have to assume that there was a constant environment against which you're making that judgment. But that's not true. Evolution does not produce more optimal or fit organisms over time. It's not progress in fitness over time. And here's the biggest constraint on UGM. What's optimal from a biological standpoint, that is, what's most conducive to reproductive fitness, is not the same as, and may be at odds with, what we rightly value. Maximizing the number of genes current generation passes on is not the only thing of value. In fact, it may be of no value in itself at all. To make this clearer, suppose the best way to maximize the number of genes we're passing on would be to have a really huge human population hovering at subsistence level and producing as many more new human beings as possible. That doesn't sound like something we would want, right? It sounds ghastly. Another constraint. Under UGM, the spread of desirable mutations may be too slow and at too great a cost in human terms. For example, huge death rates from smallpox and bubonic plague required to diffuse and fix mutations conferring resistance. Okay? So it's not just that evolution doesn't really care about us and only achieves things that are good for us by coincidence, but even when it just does happen to achieve something that's good for us, like widespread resistance to an infectious disease, the method by which this is accomplished can involve huge human cost. In contrast, IgM, again in principle, could spread desirable mutations more quickly and without such human cost. Another constraint on UGM, once you get above the level of bacteria, there's very little lateral gene transfer. Bacteria have huge advantages over us. They can glom up genes from other lineages and incorporate them into their own. They also have a much faster reproductive cycle, so in the arms race with them, we're likely to fall behind. But with IgM, it's possible to use not just genes that are in the lineage of the organism in question, but to borrow genes from other lineages in the same species or even from different species, or to create artificial chromosomes, new packets of coding DNA. So just from an engineering standpoint, that's a huge advantage of IgM over UGM. Here's another problem with UGM, what I call Pleistocene hangovers. Evolutionary biologists talk about the environment of evolutionary adaptation. They think that for the human species, the period where most of the uniquely human traits were fixed was late in the Pleistocene era. But there's also a good deal of discussion of the idea that because that environment was so different, what got fixed were some traits which may have been adaptive at that time, but now are really quite unsavory, like the propensity to xenophobia, propensity to stepchild abuse, especially on the part of males towards stepchildren. And some people even think attention deficit disorder is something which is actually a disorder under most modern conditions, but might have been an adaptive trait for hunter-gatherers who need to be aware of all sorts of things going on in the periphery of their vision, at the boundaries of their auditory zone, etc. So, master engineer, I don't think so. Instead, I'd say if you have to go with metaphors, and I'd prefer not to, you'd think of evolution working through natural selection as a fickle, morally blind, tightly shackled tinkerer is fickle, doesn't finish projects, it discards much of value. Because remember, it's always a response to a current demand of the environment, a solution to a current design problem, with no forethought of the longer consequences, either of achieving that response or of what new kinds of demands will appear later. It's morally blind because it doesn't aim at human good. It achieves human good only by coincidence, and the methods often have high moral cost, high human cost. It's tightly shackled because it's like a workman chained to a bench in a warehouse filled with tools and resources out of reach. Think of all the genetic material that's just can't be accessed. Now, there are a number of other problems. There's the problem of local fitness optimality traps. You think of a fitness landscape as peaks and valleys. We might be on a peak that's 3,000 feet high. Our species might be doing pretty well in terms of fitness. There's another peak that's at 10,000 meters. If we could get to that peak, we would be much better off from the standpoint of fitness. But to get to that 10,000 meter peak, we'd have to descend into a valley. That is, there'd have to be a series of incremental changes through natural selection that would actually decrease our fitness. So the answer is you can't get there from here. But since IGM wouldn't have to make those kinds of incremental changes, in principle it could get around those problems. Another problem with the master engineer analogy, aside from the fact that evolution is not like a master engineer, it encourages the mistake of thinking that the choice is between, on the one hand, making risky changes in the name of improvement, or resting content with the status quo. See, when I talk to people about this, especially students, a lot of them say, well, look, we're doing pretty well now. Maybe we can improve ourselves by biomedical enhancements, including IGM. But why risk what we've got now for the sake of being better off than we are now if we're okay now? That's the kind of simple conservative argument that they give. But what that assumes is that if we don't do anything, we'll maintain the status quo. It also assumes the status quo is adequate, and it's not adequate for a lot of people in the world. That's pretty clear. But quite apart from that, it assumes that we won't have to change things, some things, to keep some things as they are. That was the quote from Tancredi from the novel The Leopard. The existing human organism is not a finely balanced, stable, completed product. That will continue as it is, absent deliberate intervention. In other words, the wrong picture is the picture, you got this thing, we sort of evolved, we're at the top of the heap, we're stable, things are fine, just don't mess it up by trying to change it. That's not the way evolution works. It's not stable, it's not complete, it's not optimal, and there's every reason to believe that things can go wrong, that there can be adverse departures from the status quo, including extinction of the human species, unless somehow things go differently with us than they have gone with other species. One way they might go differently with us is if we use IGM. We use it wisely. This is Van Valen's Red Queen hypothesis, that you can think of the organism as standing on ground and running in place as the ground crumbles beneath its feet, always trying to catch up with changes in the environment. So this may be paradoxical, but it may turn out that we have to enhance in order to preserve the status quo. How is that possible? Enhancement means make better. Well, yes, but it doesn't mean make better than the status quo. The way enhancement is defined by most people in the biomedical enhancements debate is that it's always relative to some capacity. That is, an enhancement means an improvement of some existing normal capacity. Now, when you improve an existing normal capacity, you may or may not make yourself better off overall. You might make yourself worse off overall. I mean, for example, suppose that I had a huge enhancement of my hearing capacity, but I live in a noisy urban environment. It might drive me crazy. I might be worse off because of the enhanced capacity to hear. On the other hand, we might need to enhance some capacities, not just to make ourselves better off relative to the status quo, but to prevent our condition from worsening. That's a possibility we have to take seriously. Now here's some possible examples, pretty far-fetched most of them I think. You may have better examples, where it might be necessary to enhance some human capacity just in order to prevent things from getting worse, not to make an improvement relative to the status quo. We might need enhanced reproduction to counteract a drastic decline in fertility due to environmental toxins. How many people saw the film Children of Men? This was the sort of, in the background there was sort of suggestion that maybe the reason virtually everybody was infertile was because we'd polluted the environment or done something, maybe there'd been a nuclear war or whatever. Another possibility, enhancement of resistance to skin cancer if the ozone layer depletes. Enhancements to secure compression of morbidity under conditions of increased lifespan to avoid the disaster of a huge, frail, elderly population. Enhancements of the immune system to counteract threats posed by emerging infectious diseases. Now, the status of vaccination is sort of disputed in the enhancement literature. Some people view it as enhancement, some people don't. I tend to view it as not an enhancement, but just as a deliberate triggering of immune response capacities we already have. But you might imagine that there could be more radical biomedical interventions which would actually ramp up the capacity of the immune system compared to what had been normal for humans. We might need cognitive and/or affective enhancements to enable us to cope better with major problems like war and global warming. Now, some conservatives in the biomedical enhancement debate don't use the master engineer analogy. They at least suggest a different analogy. That is that the individual organism is like a seamless web. And then the idea is you might just think that you're sort of trimming off a little fiber in that web and making an improvement, but the whole thing may unravel because it's a seamless web. This kind of thinking is characteristic of conservative thought, whether it's bioconservatives in the biomedical enhancement debate or political conservatives or social conservatives. Now, this implies fragility, right? And if the way the individual organism is like that, then we have pretty strong reasons not to try to intervene, or so it seems. But in fact, again, from an evolutionary biological standpoint, there's a lot of reason to think that individual evolved organisms are not like seamless webs, that that's not a very accurate analogy. First of all, there's modularity of design. What's a module? Well, it's a system or subsystem that has closer connections within itself than it does to things outside of it. And that's just to say that the boundaries of modules are seams in the organism, in effect. To the extent that there's modularization, there's at least a reduced risk that what you do within a module will have unintended spillover effects outside the module. Then there's also redundancy of systems and redundancy of genes, for that matter, which brings us to canalization. And the sort of homely analogy here is same dish, different recipes. That is, organisms, not just humans, but all organisms we have any awareness of, have a kind of remarkable tendency to produce the same phenotype across some fairly significant differences in genotype and environment. Next, natural selection requires incrementalism. That's how it works. For natural selection to work, it has to be possible to make some changes in the organism without changing everything else. And that's another way of saying that they're not like seamless webs. But still, even when you get rid of these bad analogies of the seamless web or the master engineer, any sane person ought to be very seriously worried about the risk of unintended bad consequences. And again, that's for biomedical enhancements generally, but I'm focusing on IgM. So the question is, how should we best frame that worry if we want to avoid misframing it by buying into these faulty analogies? How can we take the worry seriously? And how can we get beyond vague platitudes like use due caution, take it slow? In the biomedical enhancement literature, you get sort of two camps. You get people who are just dead set against it and say, no, should never do it, it's always too dangerous. Then you got other people who say, yeah, it could be really great, but let's take it slow. Well, what does that mean? That's not very helpful. That's not really substantive advice about how to proceed in a reasonably cautious way. So we need to address the worry about bad unintended consequences in a scientifically informed way based on an understanding of evolution. Take the hardest case, IgM. That's where most people think the greatest risk of unintended bad consequences is. Think ontogeny. Remember, the idea is you're going to intervene in a gamete or an embryo. That's very early in the process of the development of the organism. So it looks like we would need precautionary rules for IgM, and they'd have to be sensitive to causal relationships in ontogeny. And I'm just going to give a list of some suggested rules of thumb. And they're just rules of thumb in the following sense. If you're looking at a proposed intervention, you go through this checklist, and the more of these items the intervention satisfies and the greater extent to which it satisfies them, then other things being equal, the more reason you have to be confident that you're taking seriously the risk of unintended bad consequences and doing what's reasonable to reduce them. Never eliminate them. It's not possible to eliminate risk. First, if the IgM targets genes that lie downstream rather than upstream in the organism's developmental processes. You think of gene cascades, right, that are triggered in the process of development. Well, other things being equal, if you make a change very far upstream and it has some bad unintended consequence, it's likely that that's going to have worse effects than if you make an intervention further down where it's not, wouldn't be contributing as much to further cascades in development. Second, the IgM, if successful, would not produce an enhancement that exceeds the upper bound of the current normal range. Just take an example. Suppose you're trying to enhance some dimension of cognition. Well, we already have examples of people who have IQs of 160, say. We don't have any examples of people who have IQs of 250. It might be better to work on, first at least, on improvements that don't exceed the upper bound rather than ones that exceed the existing upper bound, because at least we know that there are healthy human beings who have IQs of 160. We know that somehow their having much greater intelligence doesn't mess up other systems within them. But we might not know that for really fantastic quantum leaps in intelligence. Also, other things being equal, it's preferable if the intervention's effects are containable within the organism, and even better if it involves a highly modularized system or subsystem of the organism. Another big one, if the effects are reversible, or better yet, have to be deliberately activated in each organism, for example, by giving a drug that would trigger gene expression. Next, the intervention does not require major morphological changes. You might think of it this way. Human beings aren't seamless webs, but they're not Mr. Potato Head either, right, or Legos. It's not that you can just sort of stick together all sorts of different things and it's likely to work out very well. If the goal is to eliminate a trait, then the causal roles of the trait, how it works in the ecology of the organism, and the causal role of the genes targeted for elimination should be well understood for a number of reasons, including that so-called bad traits can have some benign consequences. So, conclusion, there's very good reason to worry about unintended bad effects of biomedical enhancement in general and of IgM in particular. Reasonable precaution should be based on an accurate understanding of evolution, not faulty metaphors like the master engineer or the seamless web. Now, a big caution here. I've only argued that in principle, that is, as techniques, the comparison between IgM and UGM seems to favor IgM in some respects. But that, of course, completely abstracts from the question of who would use IgM and how well they would use it. That's a completely different question. So in a way, I haven't really said very much about the advisability of using IgM. All I've tried to do is to clear the way for a more rational consideration of that by trying to get rid of some false framing assumptions, including these faulty analogies, which I think have really corrupted the debate so far. Now, just a last item here. What I'm going to say now is going to lead some of you to brand me as a eugenicist, I'm sure. Okay. There is a problem called pseudogenization of genes. I alluded to it earlier. Give a couple of examples. It turns out that there's been a kind of decay of the human capacity to taste bitter substances. Our bitterness receptors are on the wane. Now, there's an evolutionary explanation of this, and that is that humans invented cooking. And when they cook food substances, it does a number of things. It's a kind of predigestion, which makes for much more efficient use of the nutrients, but it also kills a lot of toxins. Now, chimpanzees and bonobos don't cook food. And they have much better bitterness receptors because, in general, there's a pretty strong correlation between bitterness and toxicity in plant substances. So they avoid toxic things when they're choosing stuff to eat because they taste bitter and they spit it out. They don't eat anymore. That's what our pre-human ancestors used to do. But then at a certain point in our line of hominid development, we developed cooking. And the more we've relied on cooking, and also on sanitation practices of various kinds, the less we've had to rely on those bitterness receptors. And so the genes that are associated with those bitterness receptors have continued to accumulate mutations, but they haven't gotten weeded out because we didn't need that. Now, this kind of thing also happened apparently with capacity to biosynthesize vitamin C, and it could even happen with other fairly basic genes that are basic for what we now consider normal human functioning, even like vision. Okay. Given a long enough evolutionary time frame, what's happening is that we're buffering ourselves from natural selective pressures by the stuff you do, medical care, and by social arrangements, which protect people and enable them to live and reproduce, people who otherwise would have been weeded out by natural selection. So the worst case scenario is you ratchet forwards however many thousands of years you want, and we're living in the sick society. That is, every human being who's, quote, born naturally is afflicted with a series of disabilities because of the cumulative effects of pseudogenization over thousands of generations. And virtually all of the brain power and resources of that society are devoted to compensating for those deficiencies. So it's like society as an intensive care unit, basically, okay? Now, that's a pretty grim picture because there's not room for anything else among the things that are valuable for human beings. Russell Powell, my co-author in this, has a paper on this topic which will be coming out within the next year, I think also in the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. And that's the picture that he paints. And he argues, and I agree with him, that this is a question of justice to future generations. If, in fact, this is what we're doing and we know that we'll be inflicting this on people later on, then we have some obligation to do something about it. But notice, this sounds very much like the old eugenics. Now, the old eugenicists had different views about why there was going to be a catastrophic decline of the human gene pool. They thought it was going to be much quicker than this scenario does, and they thought it was due largely to the fact that there was a cluster of behavioral traits associated very simply with a set of genes, and the behavioral traits had to do with things like stupidity, criminality, promiscuity. And so you had people who had these clusters of bad genes. They had no self-restraint over their sexual impulses, so they were breeding like rabbits, and us good people were restraining ourselves and not having as many children. And so you were getting more and more people as a higher percentage of the gene pool who had these bad genes. The scenario that Powell and I are talking about has nothing to do with that. It's not based on any sort of simple genetic determinism or bogus belief that all social problems are genetically determined, or that there's an association between feeble-mindedness and sexual licentiousness, or any of that stuff at all. It's just based on fairly uncontroversial facts about biology, especially the idea of pseudogenization and the idea that we can be buffering ourselves against selective pressures in a way that will result in a progressive accumulation of mutations which can result in impairment of what we now consider normal functions. And so we're brought back again to the idea that enhancement is not just to improve our situation relative to the status quo. Enhancement of some particular features that we now have may be necessary to prevent deterioration relative to the status quo. Thank you.
Now we have time for questions.
Yes?
I have not necessarily the same thing as IgM or other genetic factors, but taking human advancement to its logical conclusion in terms of merging with more mechanical type enhancements. And I don't know if you've ever heard something called like the singularity.
Right.
But I mean, at what point are we no longer human? So we want to preserve the good things that are human, but at a certain point we're no longer human, either due to genetic components or mechanical components. And so how do you respond to that?
Well, I'm not, okay, the question is, what if biomedical enhancement goes so far that we're no longer humans? Okay, what's the response to that? Well, I'm not as sold on being human as a lot of people are. I think there's good things about being human and there's bad things about being human. I think human nature is a mixed bag. A lot of religions agree with that. And so I'm not so much worried about whether we might make changes that sometime amount to a new speciation. That is, that we now say Homo sapiens don't exist, we've got Homo sapiens 5.6 or something like that. Or even give a different name, not Homo sapiens. I'm not worried about that. Now, there are worries about what happened if only some human beings went down that route and others didn't, so that you had on the same planet these competing new, competing hominid species. And there are different theories among people who do pre-human history about what happened with competing versions of proto-humans and humans in the past. Some people think that Homo sapiens sort of drove the Neanderthals to extinction. Some people think the Neanderthals were already on the way out before the Homo sapiens got there. And then there's the Homo erectus group, and there's this Florensis, these sort of hobbit critters that they found fossilized bones of in the Philippines that look like they lasted until 14,000 years ago, but weren't really Homo sapiens. So the track record's mixed, but certainly that's one of the things you'd have to worry about. What happened if you had a kind of bifurcation in the human line? And in the book that I just published on enhancement, I have a long chapter on that. I think it's certainly worth thinking about. But just per se, I don't think there's reason to worry about altering human nature. It all depends on whether you alter the right stuff and whether we'll ever be wise enough to try to edit out the bad stuff and do it in a way that doesn't involve inadvertently editing out some of the valuable stuff. Yes, sir.
Your characterization of the less than optimal result of UGM, it seems to me it devolves from sort of a randomness in genetic modification and possibly also environmental change.
Oh, yeah. Unpredictability of environment.
Right. What confidence would we have in building the right set of rules for IGM to get rid of this randomness as an effect on us?
This is a huge. Okay. Suppose we tried IGM, intentional genetic modification, in the human germline. We're still going to face the problem that environments may change unpredictably. And so we might think, well, we've got a problem right now. We need to edit it out and make a change. But then the environment might change in the future in a way which would make that not an improvement, right? So there's always that kind of problem. I guess that's one of the reasons why any changes that you would want to make, you'd want to make them small scale and containable within an organism and then within a small population. And you'd also want to have a whole set of other kinds of techniques, some involving germline modification, some not, that would enable you to try to respond to environmental changes. Now, you don't want to be, making basic changes all the time. That would be crazy. But a lot's going to depend, I think, upon whether we achieve cognitive enhancements that give us better knowledge about predicting how environments are going to change. So this all gets so speculative because we don't know how far the cognitive enhancement is going to go. But we know that humans have had huge cognitive enhancements in the past. Literacy and numeracy are fantastic cognitive enhancements. They're really quite remarkable. I mean, the human brain can now do things because of literacy and numeracy, and because of the practices of science that human brains could never do before. And with the addition of computerized information technology, we get another huge cognitive boost. It's just hard to predict how much bigger the boosts are going to be and how much better we're going to get at both controlling environmental forces and predicting changes in the environment. Yeah, Steve.
Which I would say is part of why I'm not terribly concerned about the threat of loss of normal human capacities over the next several thousand years.
Yeah.
Science fiction writers will say the most difficult science fiction to write is what's going to happen 50 years from now, because not that much is going to change. You want to write what's going to happen 3,000 years from now, you can write anything you want, because we haven't the foggiest idea of what's going to be going on 3,000 years from now. So the same sort of issue applies to this concern as well. If we're talking about what's going to happen hundreds of generations from now, we're going to deal with what we're going to be encountering at that point. Normal human capacities may be utterly irrelevant at that point.
I think that's a good point. Just to repeat the comment, it's one thing to try to predict what the problems are going to be in the next 20 years or 50 years, but try to predict what's going to happen 1,000, 2,000 years from now. It becomes so speculative you wonder whether there's any point to it. And I agree with that, and that made me in some ways hesitant to talk about germline modification as a mode of biomedical enhancement, because I think with humans it's probably pretty far down the line, and it might never become socially acceptable, but at least pretty far down the line. There are other kinds of biomedical enhancement that are already going on, especially the use of cognitive enhancement drugs. I know just from taking informal surveys that some of my undergraduate students at Duke take cognitive enhancement drugs. They take drugs like Aricept and Provigil and Ritalin that are developed to treat disorders or diseases, attention deficit disorder, narcolepsy, symptoms of Alzheimer's dementia. But these drugs have all been found to have some boosting effect for some dimensions of people with normal cognition. And so they take these to study for the LSAT and things like that. And I actually know some professors in the medical center who, when they're staying up late writing their NIH grant, take Provigil. There's a kind of mass uncontrolled experiment going on with these drugs that were developed for treatment of disorders or diseases, but of course people get them and use them for other purposes, and with the off-label prescription privilege that's so almost unique to American medicine, this becomes very, very easy. We also have affective enhancement drugs like the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which, it used to be that people that took that had clinical depression, and now people take it just want to be a little cheerier. And I have a friend who's a veterinarian, and she says people come in and ask her for Prozac for their dogs all the time because they want their dogs to be a little more cheerful. It's not that their dogs are suffering from depression. So you get this process where even if we had a ban on research for enhancement technologies, we'd still be confronted with enhancements because they're spin-offs from treatments. And so they're going to be presenting themselves, and the question is, how do we deal with it? And my view is that we ought to deal with it in the open. That is, we ought to recognize that enhancement is not a new thing. Part of what's most admirable in the human story is that we've been enhancing ourselves. Now we have new ways of doing it, and it's better to bring it out in the open and view enhancement as, in principle, a legitimate activity. And then we can have an open public discussion about it. We can have controlled experiments, controlled clinical trials with cognitive enhancement drugs, rather than this massive informal experiment that's going on. And funding for biomedical enhancements can compete in the open with other funding priorities. If it's not out in the open, if it's not a legitimate item for social choice, then what's going to happen is resources are just going to get sucked into biomedical enhancement as they're provided sort of under the table as spin-offs from treatment, and there'll be no controlling it. And that's why I object especially to people like Leon Cass and Michael Sandel, who try to convince everybody that enhancement across the board is bad, and that we should just sort of pull up our moral socks and just say no. It's like pulling up your moral socks and just saying no to globalization, right? It doesn't work. We're going to have enhancements, and the question is, are we going to really take it seriously, in a sense legitimize the process in principle, and then subject it to a really serious public debate and think hard about regulating it. But I think germline stuff, that's way down the line, if ever. I agree. Yes? I'm sorry.
I had something along the lines of what you're saying. What do you have to say about the ethics of who decides what is enhanced? Because if it is done behind closed doors, then who's deciding that, and would it be better to have a public debate?
Yeah, I mean, if the biggest bite for your question, the question of who decides not just to enhance whom, but what counts as what would be an improvement, what are you aiming at? The biggest bite comes for that in the case of parents making choices for the children that they will have, because obviously those children won't have any say as to whether they had the enhancement. Now, if it turns out that some of the enhancements can be modified or extinguished post hoc by taking proper drugs or something, that problem is not as great a problem. But if the changes have already occurred early in the development of the child, then it's just somebody choosing for somebody else. Now, parents do this all the time with their children, right? They have ideas about what a good life is and what good development for their children is. And sometimes they go wrong, and sometimes they go right with that. So I don't think it's in principle different. But this sort of harks back to one of the problems with the old eugenics. Eugenics was driven by very parochial, class-bound, racist, nationalistic views about human improvement, right? There was no serious discussion of the plurality of values. Instead, a certain class of people with a very limited view about what human excellence was and about what it was to be a bad human, they tried to enforce this program to try to alter human reproductive patterns to produce what they thought was the good kind of person, avoid what they thought was the bad kind of person. And that's something, clearly to be avoided. So ultimately, that's why just enhancing capacity doesn't mean making you better off overall, and you have to somehow surface and really think about those questions about, well, what is a good human life? What's really wrong with human beings as they are? What would be an improvement? And reasonable people can disagree about that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I struggle with the idea of what qualifies as an enhancement.
Good.
For example, I'm thinking about the prostitutes in South Africa that were shown to have immunity to HIV due to overexposure. So in one example, you would think sexual promiscuity, like you're talking about, is kind of being going to lower your evolutionary fitness. But in that situation, no one would have thought it would have actually improved their chances. What if, HIV becomes this more mutates, becomes more communicable disease? And, those are the only types of people that want. I just think we have such a limited capacity to decide what is an enhancement and what's not an enhancement.
Oh yeah, well, especially by way of germline modifications, right? Because we have all these examples where. Sorry?
Summarize the question, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if I can summarize it well. We've seen examples like the increased immunity to HIV infection with prostitutes in South Africa, where we would never have thought that a certain kind of behavior was producing an enhancement, but in fact it did produce an enhancement, but maybe behavior that we disapprove of morally. Well, yeah, I mean, it also depends on what time frame you take, right? I mean, there are changes that have occurred with human beings in the past, and if you take a short time frame, you might think that this change has been bad for human beings. It's thought that when the switch went from hunting and gathering to agriculture and domesticated animals, that human stature actually diminished, and that the first farmers were much less physically robust than the preceding hunter-gatherers. So there was sort of a decline in some physical characteristic. Now, there was an increase in fitness because even though the farmers on average were less healthy, there were a lot more of them. Bigger population could be supported by agriculture. So you get increases like that. And that, in a way, connects your question with the previous question. I mean, when you're asking whether something's an enhancement, you've got not only the value question about sort of whose values are determining what's better, but you've got these multiple dimensions where the same thing may be an enhancement from one with respect to some traits, but it may be a worsening of the condition with respect to others. And it may only be in retrospect that you'll be able to make reasonable judgments about whether on balance this change was a good thing. Right. I mean, think about domestication of animals, right? A lot of the worst diseases we have now come from the fact that we domesticated swine and poultry, right? The influenzas in particular. Well, overall, it's hard to make big judgments, but, you know, the agrarian revolution, agriculture and the domestication of animals seems to have been good for human beings in one sense, namely there are so many more human beings than there ever could have existed without that. And concentrations of people living in the same area year-round, and development of cities and literacy and numeracy and institutions and high culture and all of this. But these things always come with a cost. And that's no reason to think that wouldn't be true with IGM, too. Yes, sir?
I will go back to her. I think her question is much more difficult.
Okay.
Berlin was the academic capital of the world in the first half of the 20th century. The people who fought eugenics were the most educated, the intellectual leaders of the world. It wasn't some kind of popular uprising.
It was in the U.S., but not in Germany.
I would love it if we could get this great medical center to enhance Patino's draft choices so that it's as good as California.
All right. So let's put this thing in perspective.
Who decides as ours is to be?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, if what you're trying to enhance around is a kind of uncontroversially bad thing, like everybody's dying of skin cancer because the ozone layer is depleted, or there's a huge infertility crisis, those things are not as controversial. But if you're sort of saying, well, what's the optimal human being, then the risks of, you know, parochial viewpoint, imposition, arbitrary imposition of values are absolutely enormous. The reason I ended by just mentioning this problem of pseudogenization and buffering against selective pressures is that I think we have to keep thinking about eugenics, and it's not just good to say, oh, eugenics, it was all bad, and we'll never go there again, and all it takes to demolish an opponent's position is to attach the label eugenicist to it, because there were lots of different kinds of eugenics, and I think we have to, it's painful to rethink these things, but I think we have to think it. And one reason we have to is that I don't think eugenics died because of either a great progress in morality or a great progress in science. It may sound strange, but I think what destroyed eugenics was the Red Army in World War II. What happened is that when the Soviets beat the Germans with a little help from us, I'd say, and they overran the death camps, and the word of the Holocaust spread. Funny thing happened in the United States in the next 2 years, from 1994 to 1947, about a half a dozen science journals dropped the term eugenics out of their masthead, out of their title. And there was this huge desire to dissociate yourself from eugenics because it was associated with the Nazis. It wasn't that there was a huge change either in thinking about the morality of eugenics or even about the science. It turns out that all of the serious objections to the science part of eugenics had been voiced as early as 1920. It's just that they were voiced by people who were marginalized in the scientific community. You know what the demographic profile was of the people who were saying that core scientific ideas in eugenics were wrong from as early as 1920? Jews and women and Jewish women. Yeah. And that's the reason why they weren't heard very much either. They may have been in a advantaged epistemic standpoint because they were outsiders, but they were also at a disadvantaged standpoint from the perspective of convincing the rest of the scientific community and the general public. Eugenics was enormously popular in the United States. The founders of the Nazi racial hygiene program publicly commended the pioneering work of American eugenicists, in California especially, with respect to compulsory sterilization laws. There were about 65,000 Americans who were compulsorily sterilized in the name of eugenics. In the state of North Carolina, the last eugenic sterilizations occurred in 1973. I've actually interviewed 2 women who were among the last victims of this program. This was very widespread. There were fitter family contests at state fairs. Major foundations like Rockefeller and Carnegie funded eugenic research. President Teddy Roosevelt once publicly said that for any healthy, well-educated couple not to have a minimum of 5 children was a race crime. Right? We had to outbreed those feeble-minded, licentious people with bad germplasm. This was a huge thing, and it's troubling because the public wasn't able to reliably identify the real scientific experts. They had misplaced epistemic deference, not deference to the knowledge of people. They got it wrong, and a lot of the scientists got it wrong. And we think of science as correcting its own mistakes. I don't think that really happened in the case of eugenics. Instead, I think the Red Army destroyed eugenics, not an intellectual revolution among scientists. That's pretty troubling. Now you might say, well, that was back then. Credentialing of scientists wasn't very good. They didn't know very much. Something like that couldn't happen again. But, of course, this comes back to the point a number of you have made. If we're ever going to really seriously think about biomedical enhancement, whether germline or by other techniques, as a social project that we're going to invest in socially, it'll have to be guided by scientific knowledge, right? But the question is, how do we reliably identify the experts, and how do we distinguish between their scientific expertise and value judgments they may be slipping in as well? And then the other problem is, right now in the United States, we have a crisis of legitimation regarding scientific expertise, right? 30% of the population thinks the Earth is less than 6,000 years old. A lot of people don't believe there's a problem with global warming. So that complicates things a lot. If there's not consensus on who the scientific experts are, all these things get more complicated.
Pragmatically, as a clinician, I am concerned about the collective wisdom of humanity in terms of our ability of making decisions regarding what is either of no worth or of negative worth to the human genome. And I guess 2 metaphors that I've written on and used before have to do with garbage and zippers. Garbage, that there are areas of the genome that have been considered in the past to be wasteland.
Right.
These random repeats that would go on with codons forever. As a matter of fact, when Francis Collins and I did a conference at Michigan back in '91, this was something to discuss. This is sort of like the Everglades, and the parallel I said is, yes, unfortunately, like the Everglades,
wow.
This was something where we would be able to use this, and it was of great value to nature, and how it was, this is not just garbage terrain, and it was later found out that these did have intrinsic value. A
lot of regulatory interactional features of the stuff that was thought to be inert and non-functional.
Right. Yeah. So it's thought to be nothing, and it was actually something.
Yep.
And the second was having to do, and the part that I argued in my presentation had to do with zippers. That if we are reflective in our role in mankind, trying to do things to help all of mankind, that we should also be so reflective as to allow for reversal of those things that would affect the germline. In other words, that if we implement some sort of an alteration, that there would be an imperative to be able to unzip it and undo it.
I agree completely. That's why I put reversibility and containability are right up there among the most basic risk management principles, cautionary heuristics. I think that's right.
And I saw that one of the sophisticated ways of trying to handle it is having suicide genes. So that, for instance, if there is not the appropriate nutrient, the gene is inactivated and that sort of thing. And that's something that I think that really needs to be understood by the audience, that it's not just we're going to go ahead and tinker with something, turn on this gene or turn off that one, and then in perpetuity for the next 1,000 generations.
Right. I mean, you just mentioned the Obama Commission report on synthetic biology, and that's clearly in the area of synthetic biology, the scientists who are doing the pioneering work are constantly trying to emphasize to government officials and the public that they think what should be done is that when you create novel organisms, you should create them in a ways that they're self-limiting. That is, that they will not be able to survive and thrive without ongoing active intervention. And that's a safety valve, right? That's a thing to sort of try to...
Like a dead man's switch, right?
Yeah.
You have to do something in order for the gene to activate.
Right.
And that's available again at bioethics.gov. So you can get it for free.
Yes, sir.
I don't think you're implying this, but I guess I have some concern that you brought up the example of skin cancer again, that somehow this biomedical improvements are going to improve us from getting skin cancer rather than fix the ozone. And we're not the only ones affected by the loss of the ozone.
Good. Yeah, no, good. Absolutely right. Let me reiterate. He said, well, you know, if you're worried about the ozone layer depleting, maybe the best thing is not to think in terms of a biomedical fix. For one reason, because it probably wouldn't be available to a lot of people who would be having the problem. Instead, I take it you're sort of implying, think about the political fix that would be a fix for everybody. And I mean, it's remarkable. We have the Montreal agreement, which is one of these really few, really effective international environmental agreements, and it seems to have solved the problem with the depletion of the ozone layer for now. And it's a great example. Look, I mean, I think you're right, and this again ties in with eugenics. You don't want to be too quick to look for biological fixes of problems that are really social problems, because it may lead you to underinvest in political social solutions to the problems, and the political social solutions in some cases may be more equitable, affect more people than the biomedical ones. I think that's right, but I wouldn't want to go, and I don't think you would either, as far as somebody like Michael Sandel says, we should never do that. We should always, there must always be some way that we can pull up our socks, have a political agreement, a treaty, a new social movement that'll solve these problems that we've created through the way we messed up the environment. I just wouldn't want to take off the table biomedical contributions to the solution. I don't think it's going to be, for almost any serious problem, I can't think of there being a wholly biomedical solution. But it might be that for some serious problems that'll be an important component. And I just don't want to make the mistake of thinking that because something is a biomedical intervention, it's automatically something that there's a strong presumption against. For one thing, there are biomedical interventions and biomedical intervention to germline. That's the most extreme kind, right? But things like administering drugs to make you think better, or to control your aggressive impulses, or to ramp up your cancer-fighting genes or your cancer-suppressing genes, those are things which might turn out to be really invaluable. Yes, sir?
It's a little off topic. I just wanted to comment on the effect of the fact that a fairly high percentage of the population of our planet has a device like this in their pocket that allows them to find all the knowledge pretty much. What kind of effect is that going to have on our society?
Okay, the question is, what about enhancements like smartphone technologies? I think this is a great example for two reasons. One, people initially thought that cell phones were going to be expensive toys of the rich. And now it turns out that the spread of cell phones, especially in less developed countries, has been beyond anybody's wildest dreams. There are, peasants in rural Pakistan, poor fishermen in Southeast Asia who are organizing economic activity using their cell phones. It's fantastic. And, of course, political accountability through the use of cell phones is really quite incredible. I mean, everything from somebody using their cell phone camera to take a picture of police brutality in their street, to people organizing the Egyptian revolution on partly on Facebook. There's also something called Ushidiwi, which is a Kenyan language word. Maybe 2 years ago, a woman, human rights activist from Kenya, who was in exile, proposed that somebody who knew something about setting up websites should try to set up a function where people could use their cell phones to transmit witnessed examples of political violence to some central node where this would all be compiled and translated into a map of densities of political violence. This has happened now. It's absolutely fantastic. I think that some bioethicists tend to assume that biomedical enhancements are going to be expensive and only available to the rich, and so they're then worried very much about distributive injustices. But I think you just have to look at them technology by technology and think about the context, and it may turn out that some biomedical enhancement technologies actually will improve things from the standpoint of justice, not make them worse. And we have to take that possibility seriously, and we have to think about what we could do through social policy to speed up the diffusion of really valuable biomedical enhancements, so you don't have this gap between the enhanced and the unenhanced. And I think that's, again, the more positive way to look at these things, to realize there's a real risk of inequality, but realize there may be opportunities for actually improving things from the standpoint of justice. And cell phones give me hope. Just one last thing about cell phones. There's a research team at MIT that's developed a kind of laboratory function which they say can be built into a standard cell phone if it's done in the production process at the cost of only $1. And what this will enable you to do with your cell phone is if you pass any liquid or vapor over a little window on the thing, it will analyze it and it will send the results to a node in a public health or environmental network. So you can test water samples, blood samples, air vapor samples, and this would greatly reduce a lot of the infrastructure prices for like setting up costs for setting up clinics and having field workers go all over the place sampling water and doing things like this. And that's a case of piggybacking on an existing widely diffused technology. It's not starting from scratch. And what we need for people who care about global justice, we need people to be thinking hard about which lines of research and development are likely to produce technologies that are valuable for a lot of people, and then what can be done to help them diffuse more rapidly. Whether it's biomedical or whether it's just information technology or something that's supposed to be an interface between our biology and the information technology, like the lab and the cell phone example.
Any other questions? Please fill out your feedback forms, and thank you all very much.
Oh, wait! Really, go out and buy my book. My book just came out. It's called Beyond Humanity, Oxford.